Good evening all, and welcome. Come huddle around the campfire. It's cold outside, and I have a few stories to share. So get comfortable on your log, have your marshmallows ready to roast, and let the darkness take control. As a humanist, I try to look for opportunities to help my fellow human, to being a living front of kindness and compassion, hopefully leaving the world nicer than when I found it. There is a thin line between kindness and naivety though. I also learnt this the hard way. 3 or 4 years ago I was 24 years old. I am a female, recently single, and living happily alone. I left work at around 3 AM, the joys of the service industry, and happened to give a ride home to the co-worker who closed with me. It wasn't a bad part of town per se, but not the greatest. Whatever, time to head home and get me some sleep. Patiently waiting at the red light, streets are void of cars and people. It's 3 AM of course, when I noticed a man and woman stumbling down the sidewalk to my right. The man knocks on my car window and I flinch. My car doesn't have electronic anything, and my window was already down an inch. Maybe they needed help or something. Why else would they be staggering around at 3 AM? Her ankle is broken, she can't walk. The lady is kind of swaying just out of my view, moaning either in pain or inebriation. I frown. I can call you someone if you like. There's a gas station over there. Maybe you could... The guy then opened my front passenger door, which my co-worker hadn't locked, and the woman stranger stepped into my car. It happened so fast, I was stunned. Even more so when the guy squeezed in beside her. 2 people somehow sitting in the front seat of my Toyota Corolla. I was suddenly conscious of the woman's leg pressing against my purse at her feet. Inside was my phone, my Kindle, and my wallet, with all the hard-earned money that I'd made in the past 2 weeks of waiting tables, which was my rent and more. They reeked of alcohol, with their eyes glazed. They are high as hell, and the guy tells me, "You're gonna drive us to the Kruger." You mean the Walmart up the street? Drive! Just drive! Okay, I stammered, and complied. Were they armed? I didn't want to find out. The guy was drinking something out of a bottle in a brown paper bag, like a class act. What would they do if I refused? They were clearly in an altered state. Unpredictable. Dangerous. Don't escalate. Don't provoke. I pressed my lips into a forced smile, and decided that I would be as calm as possible, and polite as I could possibly manage, and maybe they'd have second thoughts about murdering someone so nice, or at least feel a little bad about it. They tried to engage me in conversation as we drove. The woman seemed to be about 40, leathery skin, and quite manic. She would rattle off schizophrenic nonsense 1 minute, and then become incredibly lucid and well-spoken in a complex topic, like computer science. Watching her go back and forth between the 2 states was truly surreal. She told me that I didn't need to be scared and that they weren't going to hurt me. They just needed a ride. I nodded, and smiled, and continued to scream internally. The man seemed much older than she was, in his 60s, bald, with wisps of white hair, maybe her uncle or her father. He would only speak by giving turn-by-turn directions, and would absolutely lose his shit at me if I changed so much as a lane unexpectedly. As the neighborhood deteriorated around us, I desperately scanned the roads for a police car on patrol. I would call attention to myself somehow, run a red light, honk, swerve at them, anything to draw attention, and I would be saved, and no such luck. My passengers were becoming increasingly agitated and paranoid as we neared our destination. They could sense my fear because the woman began to play with my hair and stroke my cheek. "Hey, don't be scared. I said we're not gonna hurt you. You're such a nice girl," she cooed in my ear. "You're so nice. Such a pretty girl." Holy shit, the man chuckled. "I see the Kruger across the street." But no. "Turn left," they screamed at me, "into the sketchiest apartment complex ever." My heart sank. This is how it ends. Raped or dead. Or both. They have me idle in the parking lot, and the guy gets out. "I'ma be right back. Make sure she doesn't get out. We got more stops after this." Ah, hell no. The woman stays with me in the car, and the guy disappears into one of the units. This is obviously a drug deal. I idly wonder if I'm guilty of a crime now, an accessory to something. I wonder if they tried to get me to come and party with them later or some shit. Not gonna happen. I knew that if they got out of my car, it would be the beginning of the end. Once the man leaves, the woman spreads out the passenger seat. I think she's just making herself comfortable, until her legs part suggestively, and she begins sexy slow dancing in my 2008 Toyota Corolla to my immortal Bioevanescence. She looks over to me with the most lustful set of bedroom eyes. She bites her upper lip, and her hand travels up her thigh, and she asks me, "Do you like what you see?" Is this really happening? Did she just proposition me while sexy dancing to Evanescence? As if this night could not get more bizarre. Luckily, my poker face is strong, and I suppress any reaction. I break into an apologetic smile. "Oh no, but thank you. I don't swing that way." I hastily switch one of my everyday rings to my wedding finger and hold it up with a regretful smile. I'm married, you see. My husband is expecting me home soon. Her seductive demeanor drops like a curtain, her face twisting with fury and indignation. What do you think I am, some kind of hooker? It wasn't like that. I didn't mean it like that." "Oh, no, I didn't think that at all. I'm sorry. I'm just very tired because I worked all day and it's late." She stares at me hard, eyes wide, and struggling to focus, until her face breaks into another wide manic smile. She slumps back into her chair, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and we share an uncomfortable silence. I had to do something. No way I was going to see how this night played out, with me and the two of them. My eyes dart to the unit the man went into, and I lean over to the woman, my face can mask concern. "Hey, he's been gone a long time. Do you think you should go check on him, make sure he's okay?" Her eyes narrow, suspicious, and she gives me a wary smile. "You won't just drive away?" I summon every ounce of angelic calm and poured it into my voice. "Of course not." You promise?" "Yes." I smiled warmly. "I promise," dying a little more inside. Imagine my surprise when it actually worked. I watch her get out of the car and close the door. I book it. Rubber screeching, heart pounding. It's dark, so I don't bother looking back. I try leaving the complex, but there's only one exit, the way that we came in, which is right where I dropped them off. I pulled into a random parking spot several buildings away and turned off my car. I ducked in my seat. I should have called the police then and there, but I didn't think I was out of the woods just yet. But I was safe-ish. But I called a friend and broke down in tears explaining everything over the phone. Once the adrenaline had worn off, I started my car back up. No sign of anyone watching the gate or looking for me. I make a getaway and arrive home safely about half an hour later. I called the police, and an officer was sent over to take my statement. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but I wanted the event on record in case there was retaliation. They knew where I worked because of my uniform, which also had my name prominently displayed, as well as the car I drove. The officer asked me where I ended up taking them, and from my vague description, he instantly knew the location. High crime area, lots of drug-related incidents. Great. I still drive that 2008 Corolla. My next car will have electric locks. This summer started off with a trip to a very prestigious university for what is basically nerd camp. Most people were actually very lovely, except for a handful of rather strange, sex-starved, or just plain socially awkward individuals who made comments that would send chills down almost anyone's spine. For example, one boy made a comment about how we really shouldn't have any qualms about secretly injecting people's water supply with numerous biological chemicals as a means of testing what is suitable for biological warfare. Another brought a roll of what looked like 10,000 condoms and eagerly showed my roommate and I in a coffee shop with the biggest grin on his face. One of my 3 roommates also had a particular habit of waking up in the wee hours of the morning, getting dressed, hopping back to bed, and then darting out the door without even a hello as soon as any of us had woken up. The only real physical issues I had were at the final dance when us biochemical kids were introduced to the engineers. I hate to bag on them, since most of my brother's friends, including his wife, are engineers, but these kids were ridiculously creepy. I was followed the whole night by one kid who kept trying to teach me how to feel the beat in my veins, and had my wrists grabbed by other kids I met on the first day. This isn't even the worst of it. I have yet to introduce Brett. Brett was what my roommates and I described as the dictionary definition of a tall douchebag upon first impressions. He stuck out like a sore thumb amongst a sea of acne-ridden teens with oversized glasses and pants that were too big for their belts. He came from money, unlike most of us, and liked to let everyone know how superior he was to everyone. He sat alone on all the bus rides, and until my roommate and I finally approached him, he only mingled with his fellow Pennsylvanians. He liked to brag about how long it would take him to get ready, and he probably spent more time on his hair than any girl he knew. He was ridiculously good looking, and he knew it. On one particular bus ride, the 2 of us managed to be stuck together when we got on late. His response was rude. "Man, I don't know if I can do this." I read silently next to him as he scrolled through his Instagram pics. Glancing over, I saw him with another girl in formal attire, most likely for a dance. I saw this as an opportunity to initiate small talk and asked if he had a girlfriend. Nah, none of those are really my dates. He showed me his Facebook pictures of him with other girls in other fancy outfits. There were close to a dozen, and to be honest, I hated all of these girls. He then showed me some pictures of him at concerts, parties, and other random places, all with a different girl by his side. "They're so dumb," he continued. "I know they're like me, but I just hate them all. I usually take them out when I'm bored and we get hammered and hook up, but that's it. I could never date any of them. Hell, I can't even hook up when I'm sober." I was past the point of being slightly uncomfortable. The way he spoke about these girls was beyond messed up. He described several hooking ups in very intricate details, and referred to the girls as though they were pieces of meat. Then the real crazy talk began. "I like to take these girls out to parties and get them super drunk. I take care of them at first, help them to their bathroom, hold their hair back when they throw up. Then I like to pull them back and shove them in their vomit, kick their face in, spit on them, and tell them to go kill themselves. These girls, they're so dumb. If I hadn't been so shocked by the words he just said, I probably would have said something like, "What's wrong with you, you disgusting piece of shit?" But all I could respond with was a stare equally as emotionless as his. I think he found that intriguing, maybe a little comforting, maybe a little attractive, because the rest of his trip was spent in my presence. He would often talk to me about how I was different, how I wasn't like other girls, how I didn't give a shit just like him. He would tell me his stories about belittling and dehumanizing women, as though I admired them. To be honest, I didn't say much because I didn't even know how to respond. He was a maniac, and he really got off on treating girls like shit. We had the strangest level of friendship, because I was so disgusted with him, and at the same time he was an attractive person. He was extremely charismatic and had a great sense of humor, and was extremely intelligent. But there was something off about him, and it was only because of what he had disclosed with me that I felt I was able to pick up on it. His eyes, piercing blue, were so empty and cold. When talking about personal topics or tragic events, he never missed a beat, with a sympathetic reply, but it was so disingenuous. I discussed the topic with my roommates, and we came to the conclusion that Brett was a sociopath, a narcissistic sadist, or some other type of psychopath, and with no matter how attractive, we should all stay away. After the camp ended, I never thought I would see him again, and he would simply be a creepy story to tell my friends. However, that was not the case. My final trip of the summer, you better believe it, was to accompany my best friend Pamela on her annual trip to visit her dad in Pennsylvania. Somewhere in those wooded forests lurked a monster by the name of Brett. I had no intention of meeting up with him, but I did plan on meeting up with one of his friends, Drew. We had hit it off during camp, sharing many of the same interests and hobbies. He told me that before we left, if I were ever in Pennsylvania or DC, I should let him know, and he would be more than happy to meet up. Although he and Brett hung out at camp, I knew that they weren't friends back home. They were far too different. Drew was a freckly, paper-white ginger who was about 5'10", and about 135 pounds at most. He played video games and hiked for fun. Not to mention, Brett specifically told me that he hated Drew. Apparently, Brett believed Drew was trying way too hard to be like him, and this was most definitely untrue. So Drew, Pamela and I go hiking around his town. I don't ask about Brett when Drew mentions him, but my best friend is dying to meet him after everything I told her. Drew says he can invite us to a party, and then we can all catch up. We ended up going, since apparently Pamela thought spending the night making venison jerky wasn't a preferable alternative to meeting up with a crazed individual. The party ends up being something out of a nightmare. Raging college kids and a shit ton of drugs. All the stuff that would make me want to hide in a corner. Pamela was having a blast, and so far I imagined to avoid consuming any of the drinks Brett was shoving in my hand. He was staying way too close to me the whole night, trying to pull me onto him when we sat on couches, grazing my ass whenever I stood near him, and at one point he pressed against the wall and forcibly kissed my neck, before his not date came around and got very pissy with the both of us. I hid from him for the rest of the night. Eventually, the party began breaking up, because someone got wind that the cops were coming. Drew was rushing me to the car, but I couldn't find Pamela anywhere. I looked in the bathroom, and found Pamela flipping her shit and dragging me to the tub. There in the tub was Brett State. She was surrounded by vomit, and her face and lips were palish blue. The both of us began freaking out because she wasn't breathing. I called Drew, and he raced into the house, and the three of us dragged her out the front and called an ambulance. Drew was pretty stoned, but told us to wait in the car, and he would explain everything to the cops since he didn't want to get us in trouble. The cops came and questioned everyone at the scene. The girl was taken away, and Pamela ended up having to call her dad to pick us up. The next day I called Drew, and he told me the girl was alright. She had also spoken to Brett, who seemed completely unfazed by everything. Apparently, she passed out whilst they were fooling around in the basement, so we took the liberty of dumping her in the bathtub where he knew someone would find her, since she was his friend. Then he split, because he didn't want to get into any trouble for drinking underage. I know the world is a pretty messed up place, and people can be downright evil, but to witness this firsthand is rather nauseating. Brett is only 18, and it terrifies me to think about what he's capable of. Imagine in a few years. So I truly hope I never have to look into your soulless eyes again. Please, let's not meet. My best friend Logan and I were 20 years old when this took place. We were driving from Washington to California, and then to Mexico. It was pretty late at night, and I was in the passenger seat, asleep. I woke up to the sound of talking, and looked to see Logan muttering to himself. I asked him what he was doing, and he jumped and said he was embarrassed that I'd caught him. He didn't know what to say, and I just said, "Don't worry about it, it's nothing." I asked him if he wanted me to drive, and he said no, so I fell back asleep. I woke up a little while later and switched the playlist on my iPod. I looked at him, and he wasn't muttering anymore. I fell back asleep. The next time I woke up, the car was stopped. We were in a field, and Logan was gone. I of course flipped out and got out of the car. I could see the road we were driving on. Logan had driven off the road and into a field about 50 feet. I found him sitting in front of the car muttering. I demanded that he tell me what the hell was going on, but he says that he didn't know, and I got back in the car and drove us to a motel. The next morning he was laughing and acting totally normal, and told me that the night before was nothing, and that I needed to forget about it. Let me start off by saying that I'm a single gay male, so naturally I use apps like Grindr and Growler. Well, one night I got a message on Grindr from a local guy by the names of Boy, saying that he sees me all the time, which was kind of creepy to begin with, since the profile picture was just a tongue sticking out, and no noticeable features. Not 2 days later, I get another message, asking if I smoked weed, to which I replied, "Yeah, sometimes," and he invited me over to his apartment in our complex to smoke, to which I accepted. Everything started off innocent enough, conversation, smoking, although it seemed he was already high from before I got there, and judging on how much he was giggling at little things. As the night goes on, he tells me that I need to take the weed with me, because it was mine, that I told him to buy it for me, which I didn't, and I argued the fact that he offered. That no mention of buying ever occurred. We sort of argued for a little while, so just to shut him up I told him that I would give him $40 the next day after work. Later that night after I left, he proceeds to text me that I need to give him the money, or he's going to bring the weed over, or take it to my job. Again, I told him that I'd bring in the 40 the next day, and this continued several times until the next day. By now he's getting on my nerves. Meanwhile, I'm telling him that I can't have the weed, nor do I want it, and just to give it to someone or whoever. So after work I get the money. He tells me that I have to help him pay off his traffic ticket that he got, because he went to give the weed to someone, but got pulled over for not using a signal. So now he's telling me that I have to give him 160 because he can't have a ticket, because he's trying to get custody of his kids, which, looking on it now, I doubt was even a factor. So I get another 140 to give him. By now the traffic ticket has gone up to 200, which sends up red flags, and I told him I couldn't, nor wouldn't pay it. To be perfectly clear, I was not giving him money to help him out, but out of self-defense to get him away from me, since I didn't know what to expect in case he was dangerous. I had to backpedal my steps and tell him I lied about where I lived and worked, just so that he wouldn't get involved. But truthfully, I was glad I never gave him my name, or got his. He didn't have much to go on besides my physical description, and I was afraid that he'd try and find my apartment by asking around, which is exactly what happened. I quickly hid in the bedroom closet whilst my roommate answered the door, and told him they hadn't seen who he was looking for. I quickly called my boss and told him a very condensed version of the story, and told him if someone comes looking for me who doesn't know my name and just knows what I look like, that I don't work there, and that they don't know me. Then I get a barrage of texts asking if I have his cell phone, from at least 5 different numbers. So I know they're all him, which is even more suspicious. I didn't reply to any of these, so eventually they stopped, but now I'm scared to leave the apartment except for work. That crazy drug-pushing stalker might still be out there, and I really hope I don't meet him again. So, I grew up in Las Vegas. I'd moved there when I was in 2nd grade. I was around 7 or so, and my mother was working at some sort of motorcycle repair shop in Arizona that just wasn't paying the bills at all. So, she jumped at the offer of a new job. Fast forward about 5 years, I'm in middle school, and my brother and I were almost exactly 2 years apart. I was about to turn 12, so he was around 10 at the time. My mother, being quite low on the seniority list, was forced to work late nights. That left me and my brother home alone after school more often than not. Our nights were usually pretty uneventful, usually consisted of us avoiding whatever homework we were assigned, warming up leftovers in the microwave, and watching whatever sparked our interest on TV, which was either WWE wrestling or some kind of cartoon. We usually ended up in bed before our mum got home, but occasionally we'd wait up for her. One night, or I suppose one afternoon considering it was still light, everything was pretty normal. My brother sat on the living room floor, engulfed in whatever was on the TV, and I was using my mother's desktop computer, leveling up my character on RuneScape. Then there was a rather aggressive knock at the door, which was very odd. I was sort of an outcast child. I didn't have too many friends, nor did my brother. Not only that, we lived in what you would consider a senior living community. My mother was the youngest adult there, and was around her mid-30s. My brother, being too short to reach the peephole, doesn't move, only slightly reacts and looks at me. I get up off the computer chair and make my way to the front door to glance out the peephole. I see a man in a black ski mask staring at me through the peephole. It definitely didn't seem real. It sort of seemed like something from a cliché movie, as if he were dressed to rob a bank. I was immediately scared shitless, and I obviously didn't bother asking who it was. I silently stepped away, shut off the TV, grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian, and ran towards my bedroom. Once we were safely hidden in my closet, I informed him of what I saw outside. He didn't say much, but was visibly shaken, and just quietly stood there holding our little dog. I slid the tiny flip phone our mum lent us for emergencies from my pocket and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator the entirety of the call, and I didn't think the man had left considering the knocks persisted after we left the living room. Yet somehow, she understood me and sent an officer over. Immediately after the call ended with the operator, I dialed for our mother. I explained everything to her, and she ended up leaving work early and came home around the time that the police had as well. I'm not sure what deterred him of pursuing further, but of course, the man was gone by the time they both had arrived. The officer was very clearly not taking any of it seriously, most likely thinking that these two young boys were just paranoid from staying home alone. It was probably just a young man playing a joke on a friend, they thought. However, like I stated before, we live in a senior living community. Who could he be possibly playing a joke on? His dear grandmother? He then gave my brother and I stickers, as if that would console our nerves after seeing some masked man pounding on our door. Fortunately, I never saw the stranger after that. However, after the experience, my house did get broken into, as well as my car 3 times. Thankfully, none of us were present when any of this took place, since my family and I moved out of the state and installed a security system. Nevertheless, I hope we never meet again. I've been home alone all day with my dog, watching football. I live with my parents, but they've been gone all day, working on a house they recently bought. 2 hours ago, I left my house to go wash my truck at the nearest car wash. Shortly after, and 1 clean truck later, I returned home. Upon doing so, I came inside, took my dog out, let him back in shortly after, and gave him a treat. The dog runs off and I begin washing the dishes. The only dog we have now is an old year Boston Terrier. Our boxer recently passed, leaving us with only this one. Being a young dog, he has a lot of energy and very often goes to the bonus room, right above the kitchen, to run figure 8s around the couches until he's tired. So, there I stood washing dishes, and I hear him start to circuit run upstairs. Man, he was wide open, and it went on for about 5 minutes before he instantly stopped. As I mentioned before, I was in the kitchen, and my parents' bed is visible from the kitchen sink where I stood. Right as he stopped running, I just happened to look into their room, and what do I see? My only dog on the bed asleep. I instantly froze. It felt like the gears in my brain were screeching to a halt, as I stood, trying to figure out what I had just heard, or how he got so fast downstairs without me noticing and fell asleep. After standing at the sink confused for longer than I would like to admit, I finished the dishes and go to the laundry room to tend to my clothes. The laundry room is between my parents' bedroom and the stairs going up to the bonus room. I stood, folding clothes, when I see my dog, now awake, walk slowly by the door towards the stairs, with his head inches from the ground. Again I froze. I hear it. My dog begins growling quietly and deeply. I peep my head out of the laundry room, and he is at the foot of the stairs, staring upwards towards the top, hairs on his neck straight up, steadily growling. This is all I wanted. I'm not afraid to admit it. It freaked me out. As if this wasn't enough, I called my dog and had him follow me back to the living room to sit up on the couch. As I'm sitting on the couch trying to play it cool for a while, my mind runs 99 miles per hour as I look out the living room window across the back porch towards my bedroom window and see something flash across the window. I thought, that's enough. Someone or something is in my house. I had considered this before, but there was no physical evidence, so I jumped up and ran to my bedroom, and nothing. There's no one there. Nothing moving. With this, I decide I'm okay. I'm grabbing the dog, and I'm not leaving until my parents get home, and we can clean the house together. I'm not one to ever pass up an opportunity for some good deal on high quality cannabis. So when I received a text from a friend of mine, telling me that he could sell me a 1/4 ounce of some good shit for $25, I jumped at the chance. He led me on all day, telling me that he would be dropping it off in the evening. Evening came, and so did the text saying that he would drop it off later that night. And finally, at 11:30, I received a text that sent a ping of anxiety running through me. "Sup man, I'm heading out of town for the night. Your sack is in the garage under the ladder." I knew exactly what this entailed. I was to walk the 5 blocks to his residence, a mutual friend's house, where he lived in the loft in a garage, slip in unnoticed by the neighbours, search until I found it, leave the money, and be on my merry way. Simple, right? Nope. Wrong. The walk started off sketchy enough, with the lone streetlights on the block going out as I left, plunging me into this unnatural pseudo-darkness. I walked along in silence, the only sound coming from the highway some distance away. I'd walked this way before, even at this hour, but I still couldn't shake the anticipation in my gut. I reached the house, which I must say was absolutely terrifying at night. Something didn't seem right. My friend is very strict with his bedtimes. That meant that the house was dark at exactly 10 PM each night. Tonight though, there was a glow coming from the first floor. This could have been a number of things. Maybe he had other friends over, brought a girl home, getting a late night snack. I quickly reassured myself as I stepped through the door and into the pitch black garage. I closed the door behind me and got searching. The garage is separated into an upstairs and a downstairs to save space. Upstairs there is a washer and a dryer, whilst downstairs were storage boxes that led under the stairs, forming a cave-like lair. I'm not going to lie, it felt like a robbery simulator, rummaging through my friend's garage unannounced looking for drugs. My heart began to race at the thought. It really started racing though, when I heard the heavy footsteps stomping their way towards the inside garage entrance. I had kicked a can of paint over by accident, so they probably heard it. Now my first instinct told me that I should make myself known. It was my friend's place after all. He probably even knew about the whole deal. We'd laugh, he'd point out where it was, and I'd be on my merry way. That's when I noticed something. My friend does not own a single pair of boots. In a split instant, I had ducked down under the floorboards behind some boxes. The door outside was quite far away, and the footsteps quickly approaching, so escape was not an option. I had to hide it out. I was so confused. I felt as if I were in a slasher movie, hand over my mouth to keep me from hyperventilating and everything. I listened as the door slammed open, the footsteps creaking slowly along the floorboards, just inches to my right. They paced around the garage for what seemed like an age, grunting and taking heavy, laboured breaths. They stopped at the top of the stairs, never making their way down though, and soon enough they made their way back into the house, slamming the door behind them. As soon as the door clicked, I bolted, and I didn't stop running until I was back home tucked away in bed, with every single light on in the house for the rest of the night. I wasn't able to get the cops involved in the situation, lest they go searching and get my friend in trouble. So I simply sent him a text message and went to sleep. I awoke to 2 text messages in the morning. The first was a message from my dealer friend asking me if I was alright. The second was a text from the friend who owned the house. telling me he got stuck at my friend's overnight, and I was so confused. Later on that day, the friend with the house sent me a link to news over Facebook with no caption. It was a news report about a burglary murder that took place on my friend's street. 2 houses had already been confirmed as being broken into in the middle of the night. The first was the home of an injured veteran. He was found in his bedroom with a 9mm slug lodged in his head, and all the valuables in his house gone. The second house was my friend's. My husband and I were on a road trip coming back to Louisiana from Iowa. We would drive in 4-hour shifts, whilst the other person slept in the back of the car. It was around 3 AM, and he woke me up to start my shift. I looked around and didn't see another car in sight, or even a street light nor building. He had taken an alternate route that he thought would be faster. Finally, we come across a small local gas station with a single light on. It was closed, and our car was the only one there. We pull over, and as I'm getting ready to open the door so that we can switch places, my husband tells me to hold on. I look up, and from behind the back of the gas station, a man wearing rags was shambling towards us quickly, not quite running, which made it even scarier in a zombie-esque way. I told my husband to hurry and drive away. He was intrigued though. He just stared ahead as the guy got closer and closer. I started freaking out and screaming for him to go until he did. As he drove away, I looked behind us until the gas station disappeared. As far as I could see, the man followed the car at the same odd pace he was walking at until I could no longer see him. Gives me the chills big time. This happened in early 2000, when I was around 9 or 10. A large majority of my family decided to visit one of my elderly aunts in Waco, Texas. She lived in a bad part of town, but due to how my family was, it didn't bother any of us. It was around 11 PM, and someone was in the living room singing along to the musical on the television. We were lounging around on blanket pallets in pajamas and enjoying each other's company. When I say the living room was full, it's an understatement. We were practically on top of each other, but it didn't spoil our fun. What did spoil our fun was the front door opening slowly. Everyone immediately went silent because we were not expecting anyone, and the only person with a key to my aunt's house was her son, who was out in another state on business. What I know now, as the barrel of a rifle began coming through the door with the person peering around. As soon as I saw the person's eyes, they immediately yanked the gun back and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I have the wrong house. I'm looking for a friend." He closed the door and took off. Nobody moved, blinked, or exhaled for at least a minute. At the time, I didn't know how close my family came to death. As soon as everyone came to their senses, my elderly aunt made record time locking and bolting her door, and no one slept easily that night. My aunt never moved out the house nor neighborhood despite her son begging her, and even offering to move her in with him, saying, "I'm not letting some wannabe gangster scare me out of my house." I wish I had the balls she did. So scary gangster man, let's not meet. A few weeks ago, my boyfriend was running late to work, so instead of dropping me off at my work, he dropped me off at the metro station next to his work. There's a stop that's only a few minutes away from campus, so I wasn't worried about it. As I'm waiting for the train at the stop, a random person thanks me for my service. I'm caught off guard, but realised that I had my military backpack on. complete with my last name stitched on. A man covered in face tattoos and wearing dirty, smelly clothes overhears and walks over to me as well. "Oh, you're in the military. My wife is too. She's the X position for Y unit. Actually, you look really familiar. Were you at the holiday parties at the racetrack?" The specifics check out, but I definitely don't remember a guy with face tattoos showing up at that event. I tell him that I might know her, but that it's a big unit. The train comes, and I walk on and take my seat. "Smith? Amanda Smith, I do recognize you." I turn around, and it's Face Tattoo Man. He knows my whole name and decides to sit down next to me on the train. He starts asking me questions about my job and asks me how his wife is doing. He says that she was feeling stressed out with her job and that she was worried she was going to be fired. I thought it was a little weird considering that she had been fired over a week prior, but maybe he was trying to be polite and not embarrass her. But then, he started asking some strange questions. Where do we go for off-site training? When do we go? And when is the next time I train with her? I realized something was really wrong, and I get off at the next stop to try and get away from this guy, and he gets off the train too. "Let's go together. You never answered my questions," he says. I look for my phone to call someone to get myself out of this situation, and I realize that I left it in my boyfriend's car. I decide to tell him I got off at the wrong stop and try to get on a different car than him when the next train arrives. As if. He gets off the car and just gets onto mine at the next stop. He starts threatening me about giving him information about her, so I stand up and start making a scene, saying that I need help. A man intervenes and I get off at the next stop, which actually is my stop. I contact the woman, and it turns out that since the holiday party, he had started doing heroin and became violent towards her. She and the kids moved out to an undisclosed location, and he tried abducting them at least once. He has been homeless, so that explains why I didn't recognize him at all. He did recognize me from the party, and was trying to figure out when she would next be around. She had a restraining and no contact order against him, so she encouraged me to contact the police if this ever happened again. I decided to not take the train anymore and ditch my backpack altogether. Last week I was working late and decided to walk over the train stop to get some food. As I'm waiting to cross the crosswalk, I hear, "Amanda? Good to see you." I look behind me and Face Tattoo Guy is standing there. "No, no, no. Let's not meet and have dinner together as you try to figure out how to kidnap your wife." I turn and take off sprinting down the busy road to get away. I'm definitely staying away from the whole line now. Forever. I grew up in a ranch-style house in a rural SoCal. I was still living at home whilst going to college, partially because of cost, and partially because my mum needed assistance because of her health. My dad was out of town on business often, so it would be up to me to hold the fort. Around 2:30 AM one night, I wake up, intensely on edge, with the sinking feeling that something is in the house. It was a full moon, and the Santa Ana winds were blowing exceptionally hard. I sat up and listened closely for over a minute, but I could only hear the rustling of leaves outside. I couldn't hear anything inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally mustered the courage to get up and investigate. I quietly opened my bedroom door and crept down the hallway, navigating only by the available moonlight. As I reached the end of the hall, I could hear the front door was open and slowly banging against a metal umbrella stand when I was hit by the most putrid smell. At this point, the adrenaline has me close to puking. It took all my strength to turn around the corner to get to the door. I slam the door and start turning on every light I can find and begin looking around. My heart is pounding out my chest as I go from room to room checking for an intruder. As I enter the dining room, I discover the source of the smell. Right in the middle of a rather expensive rug is what I later learned to be a pile of partially digested figs. It turns out a coyote had gorged himself on dropped figs from our orchard and happened across the door opened by the wind. It entered the house and marked its newfound digs and likely fled when it heard me enter my bedroom. Nonetheless, the whole experience was very tense and absolutely terrifying. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. There would be times when we would go for hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass didn't consist of much more than an old rusty gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear that you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up at first, and I noticed how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 PM. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked me if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for a while, I went to the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restroom were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy, tired, and realized how badly I needed to pee. So I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length, and it looked like she hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was wearing ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. Several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was hanging on her shoulders, crooked, as if she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly, and she was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave her a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense. Her eyebrows were set as if she were angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me as though she were hungry, and this is when I first felt the tinge of something being wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door, because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched, as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face, nor trying to fix her messed up hair, or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the store door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of my cubicle, and I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there. I waited longer, and finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open, and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy, and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment, and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me, before reaching for the lock, and then I paused, fingers only an inch away from opening the door. I stayed as silent as I could, to manage to confirm if I had just heard something that I thought. It was indeed breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking that she'd only just left, to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time I must have been at least 20 minutes. But I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction of her breathing that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't just pulled another trick. I slipped out the store quickly, washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store, and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door was the woman. She seemed surprised and she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the other side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was alright, since I had taken much longer than usual, and I said that I would tell him all about it when we were far away from that store. I think she may have been a druggie and wanted to mug me, or that she worked with sex trafficking. I'm not really sure what. All that I know is that I hope our paths never cross again. My mum did a lot of drugs when I was young. She was always pretty open about it, so drug use was a pretty normalized thing to my brain at a young age. Part of the normalization occurred when my mum often took me with her on her drug runs. The dealers were always nice to me. One guy named DJ or PJ or something like that, and he had cool black light paintings and candle wax sculptures. Another guy called Don, and he had the biggest, bushiest beard I'd ever seen. Reminded me a lot of a brunette Santa Claus trucker. And then there were Barbara and Sparky. Like the others, Barbara and Sparky were nice to me for the most part. Barbara was, at least. Sparky usually just sat in his living room watching movies on Cinemax and HBO. They were at least 20 years older than my mum, maybe even 30. Whenever we'd go over, the routine was the same. My mum and Barbara would leave me in a room, and then they'd go get high. I was about 7 at the time, so I was too naive to understand that this was wrong. But the room they left me in had a TV and a Nintendo Entertainment System, and at least 50 games for it. So I was in heaven. I played well-known games like Mario Bros, Bubble Bobble, as well as bizarre games forgotten in history like Monster Party and Kick or Cubicle. Regardless, I had hours of free time to explore the largest NES library I had ever seen. I was on cloud 9. Early onto our trips to Barbara and Sparky's though, my mum told me not to be alone with Sparky. I asked why, and she hesitated. She ended up just telling me that he didn't like kids, and I was innocent enough to buy into it despite her squirreliness. Despite the warning, I never noticed anything off about Sparky. Like I said earlier, he mostly just watched movies in the dark by himself. However, one night was a bit different. I was playing games as usual when the door opened. In the doorway was Sparky, holding a small glass of dark liquid, probably rum or whiskey. I said hi, but he just stood in the doorway staring at me. It was uncomfortable, but I turned back to my video game. I felt him stare at me for a few moments before I turned around again, and this time he asked me what I was playing. I answered, and then we went back to silence and stares. He followed up by taking another swig of what he was drinking and inching behind me. He put his hand on my shoulder and gave it a squeeze. Not like he was trying to get my attention, but something more purposeful. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but thankfully, I didn't have much of a chance. Almost as if summoned by Sparky touching me, my mum and Barbara appeared in the doorway, surprised and concerned that Sparky was in the same room as me. They ushered him off, and the rest of the time my mum's drug dealer place was as normal as could be expected. I didn't know about pedophiles then, but now I do, and I wonder how close I came to being abused. On another visit to Barbara and Sparky's, I'd been playing video games for a lot longer than usual, and got hungry. I went into the kitchen and found nobody. I looked around for snacks on the counter, but only found a mirror with light wines of powder and a very short straw next to it. This was a strange sight to me, as I had no idea what the powder was, never saw mirrors that small, and I definitely never saw straws that short. I stood there looking at it for a while, trying to make sense of it, when my mum came in behind me. She seemed hurried, and got a glass of ice water, and told me to stay away from the white powder, and to go back to playing games. Then as quickly as she entered, she left. I was still hungry, and she left so quick I wasn't able to ask her about food, so I followed her. She went to Barbara and Sparky's bedroom where Barbara was lying on the bed. She looked like she was having a bad dream, but her eyes were wide open. Her head thrashed about and was muttering. Something about Sparky and Christmas. She went on like that for a few minutes, and as a young child, I thought she was being funny, so I laughed about it. My mum's face just grimaced, gave Barbara the cold water, and told me to leave because Barbara wasn't feeling well. On the way home, I asked her about what she said, the Christmas man. I asked if it was Santa Claus, and if it was, why she was talking about him in the summer. I don't remember what she told me. She probably just dodged the questions, or spoon-fed something that an innocent child would believe. My mum ended up breaking ties with Barbara and Sparky not long after that. I never knew why though, but I wasn't sad to never see them again. I was sad that I never got to play those video games again though. I live in a slightly rural spot, and there are also some known meth labs nearby. One night, after about midnight, I hear banging on my door. I thought it was my boyfriend because he'd called me earlier saying that he may or may not pop round. When I got to the door, I looked through the small glass window, but instead of my boyfriend, I saw the side of an unfamiliar bearded face. He didn't see me, and I backed away from the door. My house was in a cellular dead zone, so I knew that my cell was useless. I grabbed the landline next to my bed to call 911, but the line was dead. It was just like a horror movie, where the killer cuts the phone line. Meanwhile, the guy was still pounding away and slurring, "Let me in." I grabbed the biggest chef knife I own, which is pretty huge, and locked myself in the bathroom. I stood at the edge of the tub, behind the shower curtain, figuring I might have a chance to jump him if I stabbed him between the neck and shoulders when he tried to bust in the door. I was terrified, but also pleased with my plan and waited. He started working his way around the outside of the house. I could hear him sliding his hands along, sliding, and banging his fists along the wall. For a split second, I reveled in my surprisingly badass plan, and then I realized that the sabotaged phone hadn't been charged in days. Maybe one of the other handsets still worked. I have never felt more fear than the moment I climbed down from my hiding spot, unlocked the bathroom door, and went in search for the second handset. All the while a madman was moving around the outside of my house, violently trying to unlock every door and window. I found a phone, and it worked. I dialed 911, but the closest officer was over 15 minutes away. I was told to stay on the line, but locked myself in the bathroom again. That was the longest 15 minutes of my life. When police arrived, they had me identify a cuffed, scruffy, drunken off his ass dirty hippie kid. Apparently, there had been a party down the road. He got disoriented and thought my house was his friend's house. He was trying to get back inside the party for 20 minutes of pure terror. Moral of the story, keep your phones charged, people. This happened a few years ago, but I decided I can talk about it now. After moving out of my neighborhood, I realized how unnerving the experience was. A few years ago, I was living in a bit of a rundown apartment complex. The town was a very safe, everyone knows everyone type of town. But if anything bad was to happen, it would always be in my neighborhood. I also used to live alone, and for context, I am a young female. One night I was getting off at around 1 AM from my job at the animal hospital. This was a fairly normal shift for me. I'm driving my tiny compact sedan, and I pull into the cul-de-sac that leads to the entrance of my neighborhood. I see a large white suburban SUV parked in the circle. Not unusual, as that's generally where people go if they're meeting someone and don't want to go all the way into the complex. But then it started following me. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, and there were no lights in the parking lot of the complex. I pull into a spot across the street from my building, hoping and assuming that the SUV would continue to pass. The SUV stops his car parallel to mine, blocking me in. I keep the car running with the lights off and get my phone to call 911, but there was no way to get out. I had a brick wall in front of me and cars on either side, and this guy behind me. To get to my building, or anywhere I could scream for help, I would have to pass this car. I have never been this scared before. I was a sitting duck waiting for some faceless monster to emerge from the SUV and attack me. Unfortunately, the combination of the long shift and my car charger recently breaking, my phone was dead. Then I hear my dog Tito growl from the back seat. I thank my lucky stars I brought him to work with me. He was so quiet this whole time, I almost forgot he was here. So for context, my dog is a pit bull Dalmatian Jack Russell mix. He was also feral before I got him. He's small, but has a lot of muscle and extreme territorial behavior. Most people don't realize just how small he is until he's right next to them. And at this point, the SUV had blocked me in for about 5 minutes. He sits up, knowing something is wrong, and begins barking and snarling, and attacking the back window. He has an extremely loud and powerful bark, and no one has gotten out of the SUV yet, but Tito is chomping his gnashes, showing whoever was looking that he was ready to sink his teeth into them. At that point the SUV books it. It pulls a hard U-turn and drives past me. It then sits at the entrance, where it was facing before facing my car. I wait another 5 minutes, before the car turns around and drives out of the neighborhood and out of sight. I sprint to my apartment with Tito in tow, and lock the doors behind me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I hated that neighborhood. I felt safe for the 2 years I lived there, but in hindsight I should have called the police. But I tried to convince myself that it may have been a misunderstanding. Thankfully, I live somewhere that's actually safe with my boyfriend, and a very large male roommate. And Tito, of course. Early this morning at approximately 3 AM, our 8-year-old daughter came into our room because she couldn't sleep. As I sat up to let her crawl into our bed to sleep between us, I noticed something standing behind her. It's hard to explain. It was tall, probably around 6 foot, and slender, and I could see through, but it was an outline. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to scare my daughter, and I lay back down hoping that if I ignored it, it would go away. About 2 minutes pass, and it says my name. I turn around to look into its face. I sense we make eye contact and it disappeared. I turn back towards my daughter and hold her. 2 hours later, as my husband and I are making breakfast, I mention the encounter to him. He states that when our daughter came into the room, he saw another person in the room. He originally thought it was me standing behind our kid. I explained to him I never got out of the bed, and then he asked me if the voice sounded male or female. We both kind of stopped talking about it and went on with our morning. I don't know what it was, but it really creeped me out. We moved into a rental house in a pretty villa suburban neighborhood when we moved to a new state. Around this time, my son started having problems going to sleep at night. It's normal for toddler boys to have night terrors and whatnot. He would frequently wake up and burst into tears. He was little. He couldn't articulate what was going on, but he was afraid. We connected the dots one night when my wife was reading for him before bed. Out of the blue, whilst pointing to the corner of his room by the closet, my son asked, "Is that man Daddy?" There were no shadows, nothing in the corner. He was around 2 at the time, so he was going to bed when it was still relatively light outside. He saw the form of a man standing in the corner. He only mentioned it one other time when he came out of his room asking, "Who is in my room?" We checked, and no one was there. We wonder if he was seeing him at night, and it was scaring him, because in the course of the year he saw someone twice during the day, and I fear what he saw at night. After we moved, he never mentioned it again. I don't think he remembers it, and for that, I am thankful. I remember seeing my grandmother when she passed. I know, I saw her and I wasn't dreaming. She wasn't transparent or anything. It was just like seeing someone who's alive today. There were also other experiences I had growing up in my childhood home. With that, I'm still not sure of what I saw and experienced. I wonder if the mind plays tricks on you and makes you think about what you saw. So this story. I was visiting my mum last night with my kids. My mum had a chihuahua who passed about 5 years ago. He was a mean little bastard, but he loved me for some reason. My mum had told several friends that she would see him several times after he'd passed. She said it would always be out of the corner of her eye, like a fleeting glimpse. She has 3 dogs now, and I had my dog with me. He's a black poodle. She has 2 chihuahuas, a brown, a black one, and a white shih tzu. My brother, son, and all the dogs were sitting outside on the porch. My mother and daughter were in the bedroom talking, and I had gotten up to go to the kitchen to get a drink of water and asked my daughter if she was ready to go home. I get a drink and walk out towards the kitchen into the hallway. There's a bathroom to the right of the hallway, and as I entered, I saw the tail of an end of a dog go into the bathroom. I didn't think anything of it, because like I said, there were 4 dogs there. I glanced into the bathroom as I passed to see which dog it was, but the bathroom was dark and empty. I turned on the lights and went inside. No dog. Just then, my brother came in from outside, and I asked him if any of the dogs had come inside the house. He said no, they're still outside. I said I just saw a dog go into the bathroom, and he looked at me. Well, all the dogs are out here. I went on into the bedroom where my mother and daughter were, and I told them what I saw. My mother said, "It was Levy. I told you I see him all the time." I know. I saw a dog go into that bathroom. There is no way that you could convince me that I didn't. It didn't scare me or freak me out. It just really got me thinking that I saw something paranormal. When I was younger, me and my family went on a road trip to Wyoming to see Yellowstone National Park. It's a beautiful place if you haven't seen it yet. I'd recommend it. Anyway, so from our home in California, it was about a 17-hour drive in our Yukon XL, the largest, most comfortable road trip SUV you can imagine. It took us several days worth of on and off driving to get there, and during the nights, we would try to find a little motel to rest at. One of the nights, due to us being behind schedule, my dad attempted to drive through the night to get us there sooner. He made it probably in the wee hours of the night before he deemed it safe to park us in this little unlit rest stop in the middle of the woods, in some flyover state. Me and my brothers had fallen asleep in the car several hours before he'd stopped, so for at least a couple of hours we were all asleep in the car, in this dark little parking lot surrounded by forest. Having got a good couple of hours sleep and being in a pretty comfortable position, I woke up in the middle of the night, quite disoriented and not really scared. I looked around and see everyone fast asleep in this pitch black car, and naturally, I felt alone. I tried to fall back asleep, but it's just not working out. And so, I sit there for a while, boredom settling in, looking out the window to see where we are. It's pitch black, and I couldn't see jack shit, and get the overwhelming feeling that we shouldn't be here. Luckily, I wasn't the type to pack light, and I had brought a couple of flashlights in my bag. Being careful not to disturb my sleeping family, I reached into the back seat, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a little plastic yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest, but it was enough to see the foreground of general surroundings. I put it up to the glass, making sure not to make any noise, and pushed the little switch into the on position. I pressed my face against the glass and looked out. At first, it looked like a normal tree line with some bushes. Whatever. But as I scanned the darkness, looking for animals and buildings, I noticed this dark shape standing between the 2 trees in the distance. It looked like the shape of a man, but it was not moving, just sitting there. And after watching it for a good while and seeing no real signs of movement, I just assumed it was a bush of some kind or natural occurrence. Just as I was about to turn the light off and reattempt sleep, I saw the shadow shape turn 90 degrees and moved behind a tree, disappearing from sight. This scared the shit out of me, and I immediately turned off the flashlight and threw my sweater turned blanket over my head, shutting my eyes tightly and covering my ears. I was paralyzed with fear, too full of adrenaline to get any sleep. Just sat in this semi-fetal position being scared, clutching my flashlight for the rest of the night. I waited until the sun came up, and we were back on the road before I managed to get any sleep. I never told anyone about the man I saw in the woods. My mother was arrested for drug possession one summer. My ex-roommate and myself were invited to stay at my mother's friend's house that very night, because our house was experiencing severe problems regarding the electricity and power. It was around midnight when we began turning off the lights, as well as the TV, and prepared for bed. About 20 minutes later, I hear what sounds like my mother's voice calling my name from what I assume was outside, which absolutely shook me. So much so that I shot up out of bed like a bullet and stared directly at the front door in the distance. I thought I was going insane when I asked my roommate if she heard it too. She replied that she had, and I just about had a meltdown. I learned that morning that my mother was in the police department all night, which was pretty goddamn far from the house we resided in. I've experienced paranormal activity just about my entire life. Everything ranging from blue lights hovering over our desert town, only to shoot across the sky in a blink of an eye, to ghostly women gripping my hand when I was a child, and leading me to different places within my house, which, by the way, were not very far from an ancient graveyard. I've always tried my best to remain skeptical about the supernatural and paranormal, but damn, that voice mimicking my mum was absolutely wild. Molly? Where are you? Absolutely creepy as hell. Whatever it was, I hope it never comes back. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I have a few big announcements indeed. I have a very big and special video planned for you guys, dropping in the next day or two. It is probably the best creepypasta I've ever read. Not to mention it's featuring the amazing Nature's Temper. So stay tuned, as we're going to impress you. It's not to be missed. Also, my artist Angeliki has started her own channel telling scary stories. It would mean the world to me if you would click the link on screen later or in the description to check her out and show her some love. Thanks guys. Don't forget that the merch store is back, so head on over for some sweet Mortis Media themed apparel. Best get it quickly if you want it before the holidays. And remember that if you enjoyed today's video, please consider dropping a like and leaving a comment, as it is a really great way to help support the channel and I appreciate it tremendously. And if you'd like to do something incredible and perhaps even a little festive to help support the channel further, feel free to visit my Patreon. You can find the link in the description as well as the links to my social media. And if you would like your story read on my channel, you can submit it as a text post to Reddit, or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. And why not join me using the link on screen now to follow me over to Angeliki's channel. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.